It's my great pleasure to welcome from the Morgan Room Sarah Weatherwax, who's joining us virtually. Sarah I've known since she joined the library company in 1993, and we've been pleased at the Philadelphia Club to have enjoyed her tours of exhibitions that she's organized at the library company during many of those years. And she's been our guest here in person and today virtually, and we hope we can have you here in person again very soon. A little background on Sarah. She received her BA in history from the College of Worcester, an MA in history from the College of William and Mary. And she's written articles for the Daguerrean Annual, the magazine Antiques, Pennsylvania History, and Imprint, the Journal of the American Historical Print Collectors Society. And she's co-authored a book about 19th century photographic views of Center City, Philadelphia, obviously very pertinent to today's topic. And she's also contributed a chapter about lithographer Peter Estival to Philadelphia on Stone, Commercial Lithography in Philadelphia, 1828 to 1878. The exhibitions that she's curated have been on topics as diverse as music in Philadelphia, Philadelphia Daguerreotypes, and Philadelphia Homefront during World War I. Federal artist William Birch and the work of William Rao, the Pennsylvania Railroad's official photographer, are among other subjects of hers. Other research interests include women in photography and Philadelphia's built environment. Sarah currently serves on the board of the American Historical Print Collectors Society and the Daguerrean Society. Today she'll be talking to us about Philadelphia as a center for early American photography. And we're going to keep everybody on mute until the end of the talk, and we'll open up for questions at that time. Should you wish to submit your questions in advance, please use, Bob, please sit down and join the others. Please submit via the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Sarah, thank you so much for coming, and please take it away.
Thank you. Well, welcome to everyone. I would like to start by thanking Jay Stiefel, who contacted me months and months ago about being one of the Philadelphia Club's lunchtime speakers. I'm honored to be here, or be here sort of, at least virtually. Thanks as well to Anthony Tarselli, who organized the technical run-through of the presentation last week. So hopefully we will have no glitches during the next hour, or at least no glitches that he cannot easily solve. Most of all, thanks to all of you who are still willing to attend Zoom events and have given up an hour of your day to listen to my presentation about early photography in Philadelphia. As the title slide states, I've based this talk on materials in the collection of the Library Company of Philadelphia, an independent research library founded in 1731 by Benjamin Franklin and a group of his friends, and where I serve as Senior Curator of Graphic Arts. As we go through my presentation, all of the examples you will see are from the Library Company unless otherwise noted. Frenchman Louis Daguerre publicly announced his successful capture of an image on a silvered piece of copper in August of 1839. Although Daguerre gets the most credit for starting photography, I certainly want to acknowledge that others were experimenting with photography before him and at the same time as him. Daguerre, however, made his discovery freely accessible to all. Philadelphians read about the process on September 25th, 1839, when the United States Gazette, a newspaper, published the basic directions to making a daguerreotype, and Philadelphians began experimenting. I wanted to give you a sense of what the city was like around the time that the news of Daguerre's discovery reached its inhabitants. Here we see lithographic views taken from the steeple of Independence Hall, looking in each direction. East and west are on the top row, and north and south are on the bottom row. Most of the city still hugged the Delaware River, but was gradually spreading westward. Philadelphia's population in 1840 was 93,665 residents, making it the fourth largest city in the United States. New York City was by far the nation's most populous, followed by Baltimore and New Orleans. Boston closely followed Philadelphia in size. Although Philadelphia was not the nation's largest city, I would contend our city was the center of American photography for its first 50 years. Shortly after the United States Gazette published directions for making a daguerreotype, Philadelphian Joseph Saxton created the daguerreotype you see here on the left. Saxton was in charge of machinery and weights and measures at the U.S. Mint, and this is the view of Central High School from a window in the Mint. It's the oldest extant American daguerreotype and is part of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania's collection. Let me take a moment here to explain what a daguerreotype is now that we are looking at one. A daguerreotype is a one-of-a-kind image developed on a silver-coated copper plate. No negative is created, each image is unique. Daguerreotype plates can range in size from as small as 1.5 inches by 1 3/4 inches up to 6.5 by 8.5 inches, and are identified by plate size, such as a whole plate, a quarter plate, or down to a tiny 1/16 plate size. And here is where I have to make a confession. A few years after I started at the library company, I had the opportunity to see the Saxton Daguerreotype in person, and I was completely underwhelmed. It is very small, and the image that you see in the slide here has been enhanced. It is much harder to make out the actual image of Central High School when you see the daguerreotype in person. I understand that this is a piece of the true cross for photo historians, but if you don't fall into that group, you most likely will be not that impressed if you saw this in person. Daguerreotypes reverse the actual image seen with your eyes. And in the artwork on the right of this slide, artist Frank Taylor has corrected this reversal in his depiction of the same view shown in Saxton's daguerreotype. Frank Taylor in the 19-teens and 1920s created a series of views, several hundred views of Philadelphia scenes, both historical and contemporary. And it's noteworthy that Saxton's accomplishment was included in Taylor's work. Saxton's interest in photography seems to have centered on conquering the mechanics of using a camera and the chemistry of creating an image that permanently affixed itself to the plate. I'm unaware of any other images taken by him, whereas the man seen here, Robert Cornelius, opened the first commercial studio in Philadelphia in May 1840, and at least 30 Cornelius-made daguerreotypes are known to still exist. His original studio was located on Lodge Alley, which is now Ranstead Street, just south of Market near 8th Street. There is a historic marker there at the site, one of the blue markers, sidewalk markers put up by the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. This image is what is regarded as the earliest extant photographic self-portrait, a portrait of Cornelius in the Library of Congress's holdings. Robert Cornelius's family operated a lamp manufactory in Philadelphia. It was the firm that supplied the chandelier in the main auditorium of the Academy of Music. Robert Cornelius, therefore, was a skilled metallurgist, and he fits the profile of the earliest daguerreotypist, men with skills with machinery and knowledge of chemistry. Although Cornelius operated his photograph studio alone, he had a silent partner, Paul Beck Gerard, a physician who was also a professor in the chemistry department at the University of Pennsylvania. Gerard himself took some early daguerreotypes of the city, including a city view taken from the University of Pennsylvania's roof, which is now in the Franklin Institute's collection. Godard's work with the chemical bromide vastly shortened the exposure time necessary to make a daguerreotype, which made it possible for Cornelius to operate a commercial studio taking people's portraits. The next couple of slides show you examples of Cornelius's work. He only operated a studio from the spring of 1840 through the fall of 1841. And in the earliest days of his business, he made a metal frame, like what you see here, for each daguerreotype, put the daguerreotype plate in it, covered it with glass, and put brown paper on the back with a yellow advertising label adhered to it. The example shown here is of Philadelphia lawyer and judge John Bouvier. Later, Cornelius switched to leather-covered book-like cases and stamped his name and Philadelphia into the brass mat covering the image. And you can see that running along the bottom of the mat. You might also have noticed another difference between the portraits of John Bouvier and Grandma Topin. Cornelius has purchased a new camera with an improved lens by the time of Grandma Topin's portrait session, which allowed him to take an image from farther away and included her from the waist up rather than just a bust-length portrait. One of the reasons that I think Philadelphia was on the forefront of photography in its infancy was the prevalence of institutions where ideas and knowledge about the new discovery could be exchanged. Godard and Cornelius displayed their daguerreotypes at meetings of the American Philosophical Society, the building indicated by the orange arrow. Godard was elected an APS member in 1840, and Cornelius became a member in 1862. The University of Pennsylvania, which is depicted in the center image, was not just where Godard taught, but also where he experimented with taking daguerreotypes. Daguerreotype demonstrations were offered at meetings of the Franklin Institute, and that's the image on the right. And that organization began including daguerreotypes in its American manufacturers exhibitions beginning in October of 1840. The earliest reference I found to a female Philadelphia daguerreotypist was in the judge's report for the Franklin Institute's 1840 exhibition, where an Eliza J. Henry was one of the 5 daguerreotypists whose work was displayed. The judges declared that, quote, the specimen daguerreotype by a lady was pretty good, but she did not win any awards. A G.W. Henry also exhibited daguerreotypes, but neither seems to have pursued daguerreotyping after this initial foray into experimenting with the new process. The Library Company of Philadelphia purchased this English translation of Daguerre's process soon after its publication in 1839. So Library Company shareholders and other members of the public learned about the new invention through the circulation of books like this one. John Fraser, a professor of natural philosophy and chemistry at the University of Pennsylvania, translated Daguerre's detailed step-by-step instructions for making a daguerreotype from French to English, and this was published in the November 1839 issue of the Journal of the Franklin Institute. The instructions that were included in the United States Gazette, the newspaper account, were very general. You would really have to do a lot of experimentation on your own based off of those directions. Fraser supposedly took at least one daguerreotype himself, but that has been lost at some point over the last 175 years. Fraser sat for his portrait at the Philadelphia studio of Marcus Root, and as we will see, he also brought his son, Percifer Fraser, to Root's Chestnut Street studio. Percifer Fraser also grew up to be a Penn professor. But what we see here is a 7-year-old boy who may or may not have been excited about being photographed. Daguerreotypist Marcus Root wrote an influential book entitled The Camera and the Pencil, in which he argued that photography needed to be acknowledged as a fine art, and that its practitioners were artists, not mere camera operators. And with this portrait of Percifer Fraser, he has put his theories on photography to practical use. Root felt strongly that good photographers needed to create an environment where the true spirit and personality of their sitters could shine through. For adults, that might be going to a studio filled with books and art objects to elevate the sitter's thoughts. And apparently for children, Root had costumes for dressing up. Hopefully for Percifer, getting to carry a sword made up for having to put on an 18th century powdered wig. If you recall earlier on, I said that daguerreotypes are a one-of-a-kind process, but that does not preclude the daguerreotypist from taking multiple daguerreotypes during a single studio visit. And here we have evidence of that practice. The photograph on the right is a paper copy of another daguerreotype taken at the same time of the costume Percifer in a different pose. This paper photograph was made with a negative, which would allow as many copies to be made of it as a customer requested. I assume that the sword in this distinguished man's hand is not a studio prop. We don't know who he is, but I think that Root has done an excellent job in capturing the man's obvious pride in his service and determination to carry out his duty. During the run-through for this presentation, Jay saw this portrait and suggested that we share it with Philadelphia Club members, soliciting ideas of what type of uniform this man is wearing. And suggestions have been coming in, so feel free to be part of that conversation if you would like to. Marcus Root's studio was located on the 400 block of Chestnut Street, a block filled with daguerreotype studios. If you pause to think for a moment about why that would have been an advantageous location for a studio, you will quickly realize it is in the immediate vicinity of Independence Hall, a hub of activity. Visiting dignitaries, famous people, and ordinary Philadelphians all found their way to the busy location. This 1851 stylized view of the block shows 3 different daguerreotype studios: Marcus Root, Broadbent and Company, and Samuel Van Loan, all vying for the public's attention. Here is an example of the work coming out of the studio of one of Marcus Root's competitors on Chestnut Street, Samuel Broadbent. Broadbent's name does not appear on the case or mat of this daguerreotype. We have made the attribution on the basis of the studio prop, a window frame with a creeping vine, which appears in other marked Broadbent studio images. We don't know the name of this young woman, only that she was a member of the Dickerson family, a middle-class Black Philadelphia family. Portraits of other family members taken in different city studios are also part of the library's collection. Throughout his long photographic career, Samuel Broadbent worked with different partners, including one woman, Sarah Garrett Hughes. It's difficult to see in this slide, but the velvet pad in the interior of the daguerreotype case in the center reads S.G. Hughes. This is the only example in the library's collection of a daguerreotype taken by a woman. I became a bit obsessed with Hughes and could probably spend the rest of my allotted time talking about her life and career, but I will instead provide you with just the Cliff Note version. I was able to learn more about Hughes than might be expected because her father was Thomas Garrett, an important person in the Philadelphia-Wilmington Underground Railroad story. Sarah was raised a Quaker and married a Quaker, Edward Hughes, but he was thrown out of meeting for committing adultery and refusing to say he was sorry. Edward traveled out to California and died there in 1850 in a cholera epidemic, leaving Sarah a widow with 3 young children. Her father, Thomas, had just been recently fined for his part in the Underground Railroad and may not have been able to help her financially in her time of need. Sarah may have turned to daguerreotyping as an option for supporting her family, since one of her brothers had recently opened a daguerreotype studio in Wilmington, Delaware. What is fascinating to me, however, is that she did not join her brother. She partnered with Samuel Broadbent, the man who had taught her brother how to take daguerreotypes. She and Broadbent became itinerant daguerreotypists, making images in Chester and Delaware counties during 1850, before opening their Philadelphia Chestnut Street studio in 1851. Sadly, Hughes died in 1853 at the young age of 34. Another daguerreotypist on the 400 block of Chestnut Street was Samuel Van Loan. Here, Van Loan has photographed a young girl identified as Mary Housekeeper. Van Loan shared his studio with an artist named Cheney Housekeeper, so I think it's safe to assume this child is somehow related to Cheney, which may account for the rather informal feeling of the portrait. Mary seems really relaxed, sitting cross-legged on top of a studio prop, posed in front of a painted backdrop. The Langenheim brothers, William and Frederick, were important Philadelphia photographers. They immigrated from Germany in the 1830s, initially working on a German language newspaper in Philadelphia before opening a daguerreotype studio in the Merchants Exchange building in 1841. They remained in the photography business until their deaths in the 1870s. William, the brother shown here, was largely responsible for the business end of their studio work, while Frederick actually operated the cameras. The Merchants Exchange building was an excellent location to establish a studio, with its daily turnover of people visiting its commodities exchange, reading room, offices, post office, and restaurant. The Langenheim studio was located on the 3rd floor in order to take advantage of the additional light coming in from skylights. But the upper story location also was advantageous for taking this image, looking down out their studio window and recording a crowd gathering in front of the First Bank of the United States. Philadelphia was experiencing anti-Catholic riots at the time, and the militia, headquartered at the bank, was called up in an attempt to restore the peace. Non-portrait daguerreotypes are far more rare than portraits, in large part because of the difficulty of dragging around all the equipment one needed to take a daguerreotype outside of the studio, making this a very special image. It was made on a fairly large daguerreotype plate, and notice the hand coloring in the sky. Also notice that all of the signs for the nearby businesses, which are mostly printers and publishers, read correctly because the Langenheims used a reversing mirror or prism in front of the lens to correct the lateral reversal of the typical daguerreotype. One of the reasons that the Langenheim stayed in business for more than 3 decades was their willingness to master new processes and to seek out new business opportunities. In early 1846, Frederick Langenheim, for example, purchased the American patent rights to a coloring technique invented by a Swiss daguerreotypist, and this superbly hand-tinted portrait of the Wood sisters may be an example of the work the studio produced utilizing this patent. We know the specific date for this image because the girl's father, Richard Wood, mentioned his daughter's studio visit in his diary. This paper advertising envelope promotes the variety of work coming out of the Langenheim studio. As I mentioned earlier on in my presentation, Louis Daguerre was not the only person attempting to master photography. In the 1830s, Englishman William Henry Fox Talbot worked on a paper-based process utilizing paper negatives and publicly announced his work in 1841. Unlike the daguerreotype process, however, those who wanted to create Talbot types needed to purchase the rights to do so. In 1849, the Langenheims bought the American rights to the Talbot type process, but their attempts to sell licenses for the process to American photographers failed. Although Talbot types did not catch on in America, the advantages of a photographic process in which a negative was created from which multiple copies of a photograph could then be printed soon became obvious to photographers, and by the late 1850s, daguerreotypes began to fall out of favor. The Langenheims had more success when they introduced the first stereograph images on glass in America in 1854. Stereographs, whether printed on paper or on glass, are two nearly identical images, which when viewed with a special device become three-dimensional. In 1855, with the financial backing of some Philadelphia residents and members of the Franklin Institute, the Langenheim brothers embarked on a train trip from Philadelphia to Niagara Falls, taking photographs like this along the way. The next group of slides are paper stereographs the Langenheims took around Philadelphia. Stereographic views enjoyed immense popularity and were a form of parlor entertainment. Views of foreign countries, for example, allowed Philadelphians to travel without leaving their homes. New construction was a popular subject for stereographs, as was the demolition of existing buildings. Here we see the construction of the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane at its new West Philadelphia location. Between 1849 and 1865, the Langenheims produced over 90 stereographs of the hospital and its staff. I included this stereograph because it is such a bizarre perspective of the library company's building on 5th Street near Independence Hall. The stereograph is titled Franklin's Statue, but the statue itself is barely visible in the niche above the door. You may remember the late 1830s lithographs I included at the beginning of my presentation, showing the view from each direction from the State House Tower. Photographers were also attracted to the same vantage point, and here we have the Langenheims' view from the State House, looking northeast with the Delaware River in the background. The view from the roof of Gerard College's Founders Hall also attracted photographers and artists. What I particularly liked about this image is that you get a peek into the backyards of some of the row houses in the foreground. Like the Langenheims, James Mcleise was another Philadelphia daguerreotypist who successfully made the transition to paper photography. It's always struck me as a bit amusing that the only depictions we have of Mcleise's daguerreotype studio are not daguerreotypes, but rather early paper prints. If you look closely at this image, you can see a photographer posed with his camera in the large open second-story window. John Bouvier must have enjoyed having his daguerreotype taken. Earlier, we saw his portrait from Robert Cornelius's studio, and then, about a decade later, Bouvier sat for this portrait by Mcleise. In the 1850s, James Mcleise's attention turned to paper photography, and the library company's collection includes approximately 75 paper photographs he took in that decade, making his work some of the earliest photographic views of our city. Most of these photographs have been in the collection since the 19th century. Mcleise took photographs of churches, schools, residences, banks, hotels, bridges, and other noteworthy structures around the city, a sampling of which I will now share with you. Built in 1702, the Old London Coffee House represents a mid-19th century holdout in the rapidly disappearing colonial architecture of the city. On Broad Street, Mcleise has captured the new Academy of Music building, the right-hand side, and the not-so-new Deaf and Dumb Asylum building a few blocks to the south, which of course is now the University of the Arts. Ridge Avenue is an area of Philadelphia where far fewer photographs were taken than in Center City and Old City. Wood and Perot's ironworks, also known as the Philadelphia Ornamental Ironworks, is shown here. They produced architectural elements like railings and balconies. Notice the large cast iron statue of Henry Clay on the roof of the building. West of Broad Street is another Philadelphia area not well documented in early photographs. At the time of this photograph, which was the late 1850s, the city supported about 60 marble yards. Marble from the Struthers business was used in many of the city's most significant buildings, including City Hall, the Second Bank of the United States, the Continental Hotel, and the Public Ledger Building. And I learned from Jay Stiefel during my run-through that Struthers also supplied marble used in the construction of the Philadelphia Club's building as well. Another Philadelphia daguerreotypist who made the transition from daguerreotypes to paper prints was Frederick Richards, shown here, who began his career as a painter and who later in life gave up commercial photography to focus on painting once again. It may have been through Richard's connections with the city's artistic community that he had the opportunity to take this daguerreotype at his Chestnut Street studio. Charlotte and Emily were respectively the wife and daughter of the well-known Philadelphia portrait and genre painter George Conarow. The library's collection also includes a daguerreotype of George Conarow taken during a visit to Richard's studio. This is the only example of a stereo daguerreotype in the library company's collections, and it's by Richards. Sadly, I have not yet been able to identify the sculpture. In the late 1850s, Richards began an important collaboration with Philadelphia antiquarian Charles Poulsen, recording the vanishing remnants of the 18th and early 19th century city. Poulsen collected these photographs, compiled them into scrapbooks, wrote commentary, and left 120 of Richard's photographs to the library company in an 1866 bequest. The following slides show a few examples from Poulsen's scrapbooks. Richards traveled out to Germantown to take these two images of 18th century homes, Cliveden on the right, and on the left, the residence of John Fanning Watson, the author of the Annals of Philadelphia. Richards would work with Watson on a project in the 1850s which photographically documented Germantown. Here, Richards records the first African Episcopal Church, established in the United States in 1794. Some of Richard's photographs merely hint at the changes taking place around the city. Built as a private residence in the 1770s, by the time Richards documented the Hearst Mansion, the front yard of the residence was serving as a parking area for wagons and stones from the nearby marble yard. Here, Richards more explicitly is showing the changing urban landscape. The photograph on the right is titled the Gerard House Hotel, but the Continental Hotel under construction in the foreground is what captures the viewer's attention. Once completed, this 6-story, 700-room hotel could accommodate as many as 1,200 guests. Similarly, the image on the left is ostensibly of St. Stephen's Church on 10th Street, but in the foreground is evidence of the construction of the Franklin Market, just underway in 1859. Most of what I've shown you so far has been work by commercial photographers in Philadelphia, but there were some amateurs who continued to tinker with the process even after the earliest days of daguerreotyping had passed. One of them was Robert Montgomery Byrd, who is best known as a playwright, poet, novelist, and journalist. In addition to his literary pursuits, Byrd carried out very early experiments with the paper negative, paper positive process. The library owns more than 175 paper prints and negatives he created in 1852 and 1853 at his Filbert Street home. On the back of most, Byrd made careful notes, recording the chemicals he used and the amount of time he spent on each step of the process. And what you see here, the image on the left is a paper print, and the image on the right is a paper negative. A few years ago, the Getty Museum borrowed several of Byrd's works for their important photography exhibition entitled Paper Promises, Early American Photography. The same show also featured works by Frederick Richards and the Langenheim brothers, among others, supporting my contention that Philadelphia really was the site of significant milestones in early photography. Briefly moving forward into the early 1860s, the first photographic society in America was founded in Philadelphia in 1862. 2 years later, the Photographic Society of Philadelphia began publishing a monthly journal called The Philadelphia Photographer. In the first issue, editor Edward Wilson appealed to new subscribers in an article entitled, How You Can Help Us. Send us useful contributions, and you can chide and correct us when we are in error, wrote Wilson. When you get stuck for information, send us your queries, and we will try to help you out. If you make a discovery, let us know it. Each issue included an original photograph along with how-to articles, critiques of images, and news of photographic expeditions and exhibitions. The Philadelphia Photographer was a very influential journal with national and international subscribers. However, when Wilson moved the journal from Philadelphia to New York City in 1888 and renamed it Wilson's Photographic Magazine, it was a clear signal of the shift away from Philadelphia as the nation's photographic center. Philadelphians may have led the way with the success of commercial daguerreotypists like Robert Cornelius and the Langenheims, but by the turn of the century and the 1902 establishment in New York of the photo secession movement, which elevated art photography over realism, New York City stepped into the dominant role. If anything I've said this afternoon has sparked your interest in learning more about early photography in Philadelphia, I urge you to visit the Library Company's website. There you can find the online version of an exhibition I curated back in 2009 entitled Catching the Shadow, Daguerreotypes in Philadelphia, 1839 to 1860. Almost all of our daguerreotypes have been cataloged and digitized and can be found on our online catalog available to all. Only our most recently acquired daguerreotypes have not yet been added. It's an ongoing project for us. Similarly, you will find many of the paper photographs I showed during this presentation in our online catalog as well, with additional information. And while I am happy to answer questions right now, feel free to reach out to me in the future. I've included my contact information on this slide, and I'd also like to encourage all of you to come by the library company. We're close to the Philadelphia Club at 1314 Locust Street. And as of this week, our exhibition gallery is open to anybody without appointments. Our reading rooms are not quite open to everyone, but as things start to ease up, we will be opening once again to researchers. And I would welcome helping any of you who are interested in our resources. Thank you.
Sarah, that was absolutely fantastic. I want to thank you on behalf of the club, both members who are virtual and those who are with us today. I was pleased that you referenced the Struthers collection, courtesy of Wayne Povey from our office. I'm happy to report that we still have the original account book of the Knight brothers, D.R. and R.T. Knight, who constructed the clubhouse in 1837 and 1838. And within there is a receipt dated January the 8th, 1837, from John Struthers, who I think was the second generation of the Struthers Marble Company, for $1,000 for marble work done at the club. And we're not exactly sure what the marble work was. They were known, apart from supplying the marble, for their fabrication of marble. And we have 7 very elaborate Egyptian revival mantelpieces at the club of the appropriate era. So it may have come from them, or it may have been outside the entry of our club, around the doorway. Also, you mentioned Robert Cornelius. I had not realized that he was the scion of the Cornelius manufactory of ornaments and chandeliers, many of which we have in the club are original gas chandeliers, which we have, of course, electrified. And but we'll give you a tour of those when you come. But it's great to see his name also represented in your research. Now, we have several questions. One that pertains to, I should mention one other thing. You showed Mcleise, the things from the Mcleise collection, and also from the Frederick Richards and a joint venture, I guess I should put it, with Charles Poulsen. And Poulsen and Mcleise were great antiquarians. What can you tell us about their significance in both Mcleise and Poulsen in collecting the work of these early photographers and daguerreotypists?
Well, we are incredibly indebted to them for collecting this work and making sure that it was saved. As I mentioned, I think the library company has about 120 photographs that Poulsen included in his scrapbooks. And certainly Poulsen's scrapbooks were not just photographs. He included newspaper clippings, lots of commentary, things that he wrote down as well. And, the Mcleise family, father and son, just collected voraciously, not only these early 19th century examples of 19th century photographs, but also, broadsides and pieces of ephemera and basically everything they could get their hands on. And that material came to the library company in the late 19th century. I think their first gift was, I want to say 1888. It was in the late 1880s. So really those collections form the core of the library company's graphic holdings, at least in terms of photographs. The works of Richards, Mcleise, those folks that I mentioned during the presentation are really, and the Langenheims, those are the core group of photographers that we have expanded beyond. But it's really, because they collected the material and gave it to the library company, that the library company right from the start has had such an important collection of photography, early photography in Philadelphia.
We recently had as a speaker Richard Bell, about his new book, Stolen, about the reverse Underground Railroad in Philadelphia. And he gave the library, and he's also a library company member, a shareholder, I might add. He gave a shout out to the library for the richness he discovered in your department of these Frederick de Bourgh Richards photographs, which were crucial to his research. We have a question I'm going to ask Bob Hauser, who's one of our members and the executive officer and a member of the American Philosophical Society that you mentioned today, to come up to the podium and ask it directly. Please, Bob.
A couple of questions and comments. You mentioned some folks who had been members of the American Philosophical Society. I wonder if the society itself had any substantial connection with that, other than the membership, with that early photographic work. The other thing I wanted to ask about, and you didn't show it, although I think it may be in your collection, excuse me, is the early daguerreotype of one of the heroes of that society, Pierre-Stéphane Duponceau, who had a daguerreotype taken of him wearing spectacles shortly before he died in the early 1840s. So I'd be interested in anything you have to say about those observations.
Well, I certainly was aware of the collections at the APS. When I did my exhibition back in 2009, I went to APS to do some research. I think I ended up not, wow, it's a decade ago and I can't quite remember. I don't think I borrowed anything from APS for the actual exhibition, but I made several visits there looking at your collection. The APS was a site of demonstrations, not of the process, I don't think, of daguerreotyping, but the opportunity for early people like Gerard and Cornelius and others to show their daguerreotypes to the members. I know I read in the proceedings of the American Philosophical Society mentions of members were treated to, looking at various images that Cornelius or, Gerard brought in. And the image, the Duponceau image, I know was included. There was a fairly recent, within the last couple of years, a conservator based in Philadelphia, she's now with the Library of Congress, was working on a Robert Cornelius project and included that daguerreotype as part of the survey that she did, really trying to learn more about the plates and the, from a slightly less from a historical curatorial point of view and more from a point of view of how a conservator would look at the image and what she could tell us about, how the plates were polished or that kind of thing. And definitely APS's collection was included in that survey.
Glad you mentioned a conservator, because one of the questions was regarding conservation and how well the daguerreotype images have held up over the years compared to other examples of early photography.
Yes, I thought you were going to go in the direction of, should you do conservation on your daguerreotypes? And I was going to say, no, please don't if you're not a trained conservator, because you'll end up with a disaster. And actually, I think is Barbara Lemon one of the people at this? I can see people's names, but
yes,
perhaps
Barbara is with us. I want us to permit her to have something to say. Anthony, would you?
Sorry, I did not mean to put you on the spot, but probably you can speak with more authority.
If you're able to unmute Barbara, if she has something to say, we're happy to hear from her.
Hello.
Sorry about that.
Your talk was really incredible, Sarah. I enjoyed it so much and learned a lot. I'm not sure what your exact question is. Definitely, we are learning more and more about daguerreotypes all the time and how vulnerable they are, not just to our handling, but the environment, light exposure. They're really miraculous objects. So I would just second what you were saying. But if you have
is one of the reasons that they're in these cases to protect them from light? Are they delicate in terms of exposure to light?
The plates themselves are not if they're well processed and cleaned and haven't been treated. Sometimes it's the residual compounds from people cleaning them that can react to light. There's been research on that recently. Truthfully, all of the dyed, like leather and velvet and all the other case components can fade with exposure to light, but they were more concerned about keeping out like pollutants and other environmental problems from the plates, because they knew they would tarnish, that they were silver. They knew that from the start. So
I also think that
layers are protective and decorative.
I was going to say, speaking from more the historical perspective, and I think that, you know, daguerreotypes were in cases because to some extent that allowed people who own the daguerreotype, it became sort of a private thing. You could open up the daguerreotype to whoever you wanted to. It was not something that was hanging on the wall. You know, most of them were quite small. They were things that could just be put in your pocket that you could then take out and show to, you know, a relative or a friend. So I think, you know, having a case that closed just added a little bit to the sense of something that's precious and private, really.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Sorry to put you on the spot. I wanted to also extend thanks to Tyler Hathaway, Rich Pagano, and David Thayer, who were among the Philadelphia Club members who responded to the inquiry regarding the identity and the type of uniform that military sitter was in. And the original thought, because he was wearing a fore and aft hat, was that he was a member of the Navy. But the most recent speculation, because of some other decoration on the hat and other things on his uniform, that he was a member of the Army and was above the rank of major. And we haven't gotten any more information as to the identity of the sitter, but that, as I understand from the different responses that we received from those gentlemen and others whom they consulted, the closest we can get. Now, we have some questions about, is it Mary Hughes that you gave us some background on?
Sarah Hughes.
Is it Sarah Hughes? Pardon me.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, if there was any doubt that this photography is not an art form, I think that was dispelled by the image that you showed us. That was absolutely fantastic of that couple. It reminded me of the Grant Wood image of the Gothic America. Mm-hmm. But are there other images of hers that survive? And are they always of individuals or any of them of other subjects?
That is the only existing image I have found. I found a reference in a daguerreotype directory to different daguerreotypists that was compiled in the late 20th century. Someone mentioned that they had a plate by that Sally Garrett Hughes, but when I contacted the person, they were not able to find it in their collection. They thought they sold it to someone from Norway. You know, that was a dead end. And I have seen one image reproduced in a 19th century periodical that said, from a daguerreotype by Sally Hughes. And that was of two girls who were at a school in Sharon Hill, Pennsylvania, which is in Delaware County.
Yeah. The earliest image of which I'm aware of regarding the Philadelphia Club is from approximately 1860, and it is of a meeting of members of the board in one of the upstairs rooms, showing a Cornelius chandelier, I might add. And it's not in our collection, but it is over at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. I shall ask Ken Mitchell, who was our former chair of our House Committee, who spent 4 years developing an inventory of the artifacts within the club, for which we have 12 volumes of descriptions, whether there are any other daguerreotypes or early photographs in our collection, and we would love to consult with you about those. In the meantime, Sarah, I just wanted to extend the thanks to the club again. We're at the top of the hour, and people are restive, getting into lunch. I want to thank all of you who participated today. and to let you know that while the things are, we have our big celebration coming up, 3-day celebration of the club's formal reopening in 2 weeks. But we were well attended at yesterday's seersucker lunch, and the dining room was filled. And we hope to see many more of you at the club. We're going to continue this format, this hybrid format of lectures, where speakers can participate virtually, and members are willing to do so in the same way, or to come in to the club, sit in the Morgan room before the big screen, participate, here with questions, and then join us for lunch. We're going to be doing that through the end of July. We have 3 more talks scheduled, and come September, we will be back to our regular format of live talks on Fridays from the Morgan room. Thank you again to all of you, and a special thanks to Sarah.
Thank you.